to NewsHour from the BBC World Service. I'm Razia Iqbal. In a landmark case, a court in Germany convicts a former Syrian intelligence officer for human rights abuses committed against opponents of President Assad.
I was so happy. I was so grateful for the German Justice Authority. It was as we hoped. The decision was so fair.
Ghana becomes the first country to receive a shipment from the international coronavirus vaccine sharing scheme, COVAX. First in line, the vulnerable and people who run the country.
These are going to be prioritized for healthcare workers, people over 60, frontline persons in the security services, and people in local and national government, in the judiciary, executive, and the legislature.
And a UN report catalogues a series of failures a year ago by the Iranian government after the Revolutionary Guard shot down a Ukrainian airliner, killing all on board. First, the news.
Hello, this is Julie Candler with the BBC News. Ghana has become the first country to receive a shipment from the international coronavirus vaccine sharing scheme, COVAX. The 600,000 doses of AstraZeneca vaccine mark a milestone for an initiative created to reduce the divide between rich and developing nations. The executive director of the UN's Children's Fund said the next phase in the fight against coronavirus could now begin. Thomas Nadi in Accra explained who will get the vaccines.
The vaccines will, of course, be delivered to frontline health workers. They've been prioritized, as well as those with underlying health conditions, MPs, members of the judiciary, and then also the security services will also receive the vaccines. The country has now recorded over 80,000 cases of the virus and 582 deaths. Hospitals are currently being overwhelmed with limited ICU facilities, which has been a major source of concern in this country.
A court in Germany has for the first time convicted an exiled former Syrian secret policeman of complicity in crimes against humanity. The court jailed Ayad al-Gharib for 4.5 years for sending some 30 anti-government demonstrators to a detention centre where he knew they'd be tortured. The Syrian human rights lawyer Anwar al-Buni represented some of the victims.
For us, it's great. It's a historic decision, in fact, and historic day for us as Syrians. It's a historic day for justice in whole the world. The decision today clarified that any people not just commit crimes against humanity, who facilitate, who support, that will not give him any excuse to have impunity.
Customs authorities in Germany and Belgium have seized a record haul of more than 23 tons of cocaine destined for the Netherlands in 2 raids this month. Officials say the shipments had a street value of more than $700 million. Anna Holligan reports from The Hague.
In the German city of Hamburg, more than 16 tons of cocaine was concealed in tins of wall filler, which had entered Europe on a container ship from Paraguay. The rest was discovered in the Belgian port of Antwerp, hidden in a container filled with wood blocks from Panama. It follows one of the largest ever heroin seizures in Europe. Officials at the port of Rotterdam impounded more than 1.5 tons of the Class A drug detected in a batch of Himalayan sea salt.
The campaign group Amnesty International has rescinded the jailed Russian opposition activist Alexei Navalny's status as a prisoner of conscience. Amnesty said statements made more than a decade ago about immigrants from Central Asia reached the threshold of hate speech. It did not quote any specific comment, but said it would still press for his release. World News from the BBC. Hungary has become the first country in the European Union to start administering the Chinese Sinopharm vaccine. It's ordered 5 million doses, although the treatment has not yet received EU regulatory approval. It's hoped 800,000 Hungarians will get the jab within a week. About 5% of the population has been inoculated so far. Hungary is already using the Russian Sputnik V vaccine, also waiting for an EU green light. The World Diamond Council has warned members to verify the origins of diamonds from the Central African Republic and neighbouring countries. There are concerns that rebels are exploiting mines in areas under their control to finance their uprising. Julian Bedford reports.
Diamonds are one of the CAR's biggest exports, but many of its mines are now under the control of the rebel coalition that holds sway over much of the country. Exports have long been subject to the Kimberley process, an initiative to stop the sale of blood diamonds. But dealers have now been warned to be extra vigilant when purchasing stones from the CAR to ensure that the diamonds come from approved mines only.
The Prime Minister of the Central African Republic says its forces have recaptured Bosangwa, the stronghold of the former President Francois Bozize, who's accused of leading an uprising that has seized more than half the country. Mr. Bozize fled the CAR in 2013 after being overthrown by mainly Muslim rebels. The latest advance is an indication that a counter-offensive led by foreign troops is turning the tide of the campaign. An Australian mining company has apologised for clearing an important Aboriginal site without following proper procedures. Fortescue Metals was supposed to develop the land in the presence of community elders who were to salvage artefacts and perform cultural rites. But the work to expand an iron ore mine went ahead without them due to what the company called an administrative error. BBC News.
Hello, I'm Razia Iqbal. Welcome to NewsHour from the BBC World Service. It comes to you live from London. We begin today with a landmark moment for the people of Syria. A court in Germany has passed down a guilty verdict in the first case against a former member of the security forces of Syria's President Bashar al-Assad. Prosecutors in Koblenz successfully argued that Ayad al-Gharib had helped to arrest protesters in 2011 who were later tortured or killed. This is significant. It's the first such trial over alleged atrocities committed by President Bashar al-Assad's regime. The German Foreign Minister, Heiko Maas, hailed the verdict as historic. We'll hear shortly from a Syrian lawyer who was also a witness in the second trial against a more senior Syrian officer, Anwar Razlan. The verdict on that trial won't be known until later this year. Let's speak first, though, to our correspondent in Germany, Damien McGuinness. Damien, just outline for us the charges against Ayad al-Gharib and what the judge said in the verdict.
Yeah, so, Arazia, Ayad al-Gharib was sentenced to 4.5 years in prison in the end because he rounded up dozens of peaceful protesters in Damascus 10 years ago. That's when the Syrian uprising started, you remember, and the anniversary for that, the 10-year anniversary, is in March, coincidentally. He brought them to a renowned detention centre where he knew they would be tortured, which indeed they were. During the trial, there is another more senior former Syrian intelligence officer who's also being tried for overseeing the torture of thousands of protesters. The verdict for that is expected later this year. So this trial is ongoing. But this verdict today, as you say, is being described as groundbreaking and historic. And that's because it's really the first time ever we've seen these allegations of crimes against humanity under Assad's Syrian regime being dealt with in a court of law. And it could really set a precedent for other cases of human rights abuses, both in Syria and other conflicts elsewhere. And of course, it's happening in Germany because there's such a large Syrian community here, not only these two defendants who have been accused, one of them now found guilty of human rights abuses, but also many of the victims themselves, all of whom came to Germany over the last few years in that wave of refugees and migrants from Syria escaping from the conflict.
Indeed, both these men were defectors and were seeking political asylum. But the reason that the trial is being held in Germany is under this principle of universal jurisdiction.
Yeah, that's right. So that allows essentially any country to prosecute people or a regime for human rights abuses and war crimes. Now, that's why that's why German prosecutors are able to do that here. But it's also really come from the evidence that's been given from many of the victims of torture in Syria who are now in Germany. So we're now what's been interesting about this trial, and it's been quite a traumatic trial as well, because the evidence that's been shown, the photographic evidence of the torture that's been perpetrated is really disturbing, but also the very interesting details about how you bring someone like these people to justice. So one particular instance, one of the men who's being brought to trial in this trial was recognized in a shop in Berlin by one of his former victims. And this just shows really, and that's why this trial is being recognized as historic and groundbreaking. This shows how important it is that victims and the families of victims can know that perpetrators will be held to account. And that's really the hope that this particular trial is going to now set for other people who've suffered in similar conflicts all over the world.
Damien McGuinness joining us live from Germany. Thanks. Just before we came on air, we got through to Anwar el-Bunni. He's a Syrian lawyer and former prisoner in one of President Assad's jails, where he survived attempts on his life. I began by asking what he made of today's verdict.
I was so happy. I was so grateful for the German Justice Authority. It was as we hope, as we work on the results as we wish, in fact. The decision was so fair, and details on the decision was as we expect. It's not target just one people who commit crime in Syria. It's target the systematic of crimes committed in Syria, and it's target the structure of the criminals who give order and commit these systematic crimes against humanity in Syria.
Just explain that to me a little bit more, because many people will argue that this individual was a small cog.
In fact, maybe anybody say it's a small fish for Anwar Raslan. It's not small fish anyway. But we don't target, in this case, those people as one criminal commit one crime or two crimes in Syria. We target them as part of the machine who arrested us.
So one of the ways in which you are saying that this represents the systemic nature of the criminality and the torture is that this was one of the first cases that used the so-called Caesar files presented in court. This is 50,000 images taken by a military police defector known as Caesar. Is that one of the things that you mean when you say that this is part of a much bigger?
That's one, but the details who come in the decision prove that the court spoke about systematic torture crimes. The court spoke in the decision about linking this regime to until Hama massacre in 1982. The court spoke about the target and the main goal of the Syrian intelligentsia to genocide the opposition of this regime.
Given the verdict of Ayad al-Gharib, what do you hope will be the outcome for Anwar Raslan's trial, which we won't hear about until October this year?
You know, it's sign from the court. You can imagine if Ayad Gharib charged with facilitate crime torture against 30 detainees, how much will be for Anwar Raslan, who committed crimes torture more than 4,000 detainees and killed more than 58 detainees and sexual violence crimes.
Anwar Raslan is a person that is completely tied up in your own story, because it was him who kidnapped you from the street in 2006. Tell us what happened to you.
In fact, it's not personally an issue for me anyway, but he was in the state security branch who have order to lead a group, and he have order to kidnap me from the street and bring me to the branch. And I recognize his voice when he arrested me and when he slapped me. I recognize his face when he delivered me to the police station, to the court. But it's not personally issue for me anyway. I cannot charge him here in Germany as victim, because these crimes or violence happened before 2012.
Did you ever think that a trial like this would take place? Because clearly the verdict is historic.
Sure, it's historic because it's the first time somebody charged behalf of regime still exists. It's the first time in the history the charger or the suspects belong to state or criminals control of state, and it didn't happen before. And for Syrian situation, it's the first time also charge people who belong to the regime itself, to the structure of torture.
A Syrian lawyer, Anwar al-Bunni. Japan's newly appointed Olympic chief says Tokyo is pushing ahead with plans for the delayed Summer Olympics on July the 23rd this year. Saiko Hashimoto says she believes the Olympics can be held safely despite the continuing COVID pandemic. But many questions remain. Will spectators be allowed in the stadiums? Will foreigners be allowed to travel to Japan to watch the games? None of that's been decided. Meanwhile, Japan is far behind other developed countries in rolling out vaccines, and polls show around 80% of the Japanese public are now opposed to holding the games this year. Rupert Wingfield-Hayes reports.
This is the sound of the special COVID ward at the St. Mariana Hospital just south of Tokyo. The last time I was here nearly 10 months ago, Japan was in the midst of its first wave of the COVID virus. Since then, the size of this unit has doubled, and they've been through 2 more waves of the virus, the third and largest in late January. The head of the unit is Dr. Fujitani.
Months ago, when the coronavirus and the patient is really peak, all the bed was full, and we cannot accept any patient because there are no beds at the time. We cannot accept even the other populations like a heart attack, so we're really very on a tough time.
Japan's hospitals are under huge strain, but one thing that has protected them and kept Japan's COVID deaths relatively low has been closed borders. There's been virtually no international travel to Japan since last April. Despite that, the spokesman for the Tokyo 2020 Olympic Committee, Masa Takaya, says it is now full steam ahead for the opening of the delayed Olympics on July the 23rd.
We have been able to gain a massive expertise against this global pandemic compared to what we had last year. Today, we have absolutely in a better position.
The Olympic Committee still has some persuading to do, because despite what Masa Takaya says, Japanese people remain unconvinced.
COVID is far from over, and preparation to stop infection is not complete.
I don't think it's possible to hold Olympics this year. We don't know when the pandemic will end.
About 2 hours drive north of the Tokyo Stadium, on a chilly windswept athletics ground, a group of Olympic athletes are in morning training. Lucia, Akun and Michael are what makes up the South Sudan Olympic team.
I hope Olympic to be held because we are waiting for it for so long, 1 year and something, and we are far from our family, so we hope that should be held on July.
As we all now know, the key to ending the pandemic is the vaccines. When the Pfizer vaccine began rolling out in December, there was elation here in Japan that it would mean the Olympics could go ahead. But the Japanese government has taken months to reapprove the vaccine, and the first injections began here just a few days ago. Professor Kenji Shibuya is an epidemiologist at King's College in London. He thinks time is now too short to get enough people immunised in Japan to safely open its borders for the Olympics.
I don't think it is manageable. First of all, Japan government has not yet managed to suppress the current COVID surge, which is a big one. On top of that, vaccine rollout will be delayed substantially. Olympics will be really, really challenging.
At Kobe University Hospital, Professor Kentaro Iwata is even more dismissive.
Totally ridiculous. So the inviting audience from all over the world is completely suicidal.
So will the Olympics go ahead? It's hard to say. The organisers say emphatically yes, the Japanese public emphatically no, and the experts seem to think to do so would be an enormous gamble.
Rupert Wingfield-Hayes reporting. You're listening to the BBC World Service. This is NewsHour. Still to come in today's programme, it's been 10 years since Egyptians took to the streets calling for the resignation of the then President Hosni Mubarak.
We are fighting for freedom now. We will remove Hosni Mubarak, inshallah. We don't afraid from anyone anymore. That's our final word. We don't afraid from anybody here in Egypt.
Heady times. The news headlines from the BBC Newsroom this hour. The global initiative to give coronavirus vaccines to poorer countries has delivered its first shipment to Ghana in what's being hailed as a milestone in the fight against the pandemic. We'll be hearing more about that later in the programme. Our top story this hour, in a landmark case, a court in Germany has convicted a former Syrian intelligence officer for human rights abuses committed against opponents of President Assad. And customs agents in Germany and Belgium have made Europe's biggest ever seizure of cocaine. This is Razia Iqbal with NewsHour live from the BBC. Following an extensive investigation, the United Nations has released a report detailing what they see as a catalogue of failures by the Iranian government after a Ukrainian Airlines flight was shot down in January 2020, shortly after taking off in Tehran, killing all passengers on board. This happened at a time of high tension, just 5 days after a US drone strike killed the IRGC commander Qasem Soleimani. Let's speak to one of the investigators, Agnes Kalamard, Special Rapporteur on Extrajudicial Summary or Arbitrary Executions. She has a distinguished career in human rights and humanitarian work globally. Welcome to the programme. This is a 45-page letter that has been sent to the Iranian government. Outline the conclusions of your findings.
Well, the key conclusion, as you pointed out, is that Iran has violated its human obligation on many counts. Most importantly, it failed to take the necessary precautions that would have protected the lives of all those on board PS-752. It failed to close the airport, which was the evident things to do at a time of, as you said, high tension. It was a few days after the targeted killing of General Soleimani. And yet the authorities failed to take what was the evident thing to do, close the airport. And then there is a catalogue of failures, failure to follow basic standard operating procedures regarding the use of a missile in a civilian location. I have highlighted a large number of contradictions, of inconsistencies in the way Iran has explained its targeted killing of a civilian plane. I think we need to point out that in addition to having committed that crime, Iran also committed additional crimes because of the nature of the investigation, of botched investigation it conducted. Okay. The explanation that have been provided are full of contradiction and inconsistencies.
Do you think, as a result of your use of the word crimes, do you think that high-level Iranian officials should be charged for this?
Absolutely. There is absolutely no doubt. It is not just the responsibility of the crew on the ground. These were the last element. The chain of command is completely implicated. Who decided not to close the airport? Who put in place standard operating procedures that were way below what is acceptable and what should be the norm? Who decided to conduct a botched investigation that included bulldozering, destroying the crime scene? Who decided to provide an explanation to the international community that is full of contradiction and inconsistencies? I mean, all of those individuals are at the highest level of the IRGC, of the civilian authorities, and they must be named and they must be held to account.
This letter, the findings of your report have been sent to the Iranian government. Any response? I mean, it's only been made public to us now. Any response from the government?
Yeah, the government has had the letter for 60 days and it has not responded yet. And to be honest, it also had many other opportunities before my letter to tell the truth, because it has issued 2 reports, and it is on the basis of those reports that I have written the letter. It is on the basis of those explanations that we have built scenario. We have looked at the way they explain those mistakes, and these just do not add up. So those reports provided by Iran are full of contradiction and lies. It is incumbent upon them to tell the truth.
And do you expect that there will be any truth forthcoming? Because you have said on the record that you don't understand why the Iranians are lying.
Yes, I mean, I did. Yes, I do hope, first and foremost, that the countries that are implicated in that disaster, meaning Ukraine, Canada, to name the most important ones, that they are going to keep the pressure on, that they are just not going to go away from the negotiation simply because there will be monetary compensation. It is incumbent upon those countries to demand the truth, to give a voice to the families of those that have lost their life.
We will have to leave it there. Agnes Calamard, Special Rapporteur on Extrajudicial Summary or Arbitrary Executions. Thanks. As millions of children in the US continue with remote learning, the governor of the state of Oregon, Kate Brown, has begun a major push to reopen schools and get in-person classes statewide to resume. She prioritised teachers and school staff members ahead of senior citizens for the COVID-19 vaccine. But some educators say it's still unsafe to go back, while parents are getting frustrated that remote instruction has gone on for as long as it has. It's a debate being played out across the US, and while Governor Brown wanted children back in school a week ago, many are still at home. Our West Coast correspondent Sophie Long reports from Portland, Oregon.
I want to be in school because that means I will, 1, get my boyfriend back, 2, be able to play with my friends.
Daphne Shearer is making do with her chickens.
Can you hear those peepees?
And her little brother for company while she waits until she can see her friends again. But there are other reasons she misses school.
I miss my teachers.
And for Daphne, who's 9 years old and has a disability which makes learning difficult, interaction with her teachers is really important. For Daphne's parents, Glenda and Peter Shearer, watching the halt in their daughter's development has been difficult.
This is a mental critical care condition for my daughter. She needs help right away. Maybe a social worker or a psychiatrist can help her out a little bit, but what she needs is to go back to school right now. She needs to be taught in person right now.
I started in April emailing my daughter's school district saying, these kids are in a bad place and you need to do something to help them connect with others in some way because they're human, they're kids, and they need help. Just really basically no response from the school district.
Oregon Governor Kate Brown did respond at a press conference earlier this month.
I'm going to use every single tool in my toolbox to make sure that we get our kids back into the classroom, and I know we can make this happen safely for our kids.
One of the tools the governor has used is to put teachers ahead of older people in the queue for the vaccination. But that has angered some senior citizens and some educators. Elizabeth Teal from the Portland Association of Teachers says because of years of underfunding, vaccinating teachers alone will not make schools safe.
We know that in order to be safe in indoor spaces, we need good ventilation. And we've been told that that's too much to ask for because it's too expensive. Ventilation has always been a problem in our schools, and now it's a life or death situation. But we absolutely need the funding to create safe, healthy school buildings. That's what our students always deserve.
What, Marco? Sophia? Yeah. Did you have science today or social studies?
Social studies.
What are you doing in social studies?
We're still working on.
Angela Dickey is both a parent to 2 children and a teacher at a school in an area of Oregon most severely affected by COVID-19. She says the governor's decision wasn't what educators wanted or expected.
That blindsided teachers. Unions believe that the seniors and the most vulnerable should have had access to the vaccine first. We all felt that vulnerable people should be receiving the vaccine ahead of us. It was rough to get that news and to realize, I might be vaccinated before my mom. That's not what you want. What time are Travis and Mel coming to pick up? I've been hospitalized 3 times in 3 years with pneumonia, so I am confident if I get COVID, I will die.
Great to see you again, Barbara.
Yeah.
At a senior centre in the Hollywood neighbourhood of Portland, people are perplexed and feel strongly that those for whom COVID could easily be a death sentence should be prioritised, not left baffled by a complex online vaccination application procedure and pushed further down the queue.
And that was our West Coast correspondent Sophie Long reporting from Portland, Oregon.
This is the BBC World Service with the remarkable story of Robert Chelsea.